Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulina wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. This month's article is called Seek Knowledge in China. Seek Knowledge in China. It's again from the articles of Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah, Hafidahullah. It's actually not about what it sounds like it's about. So the subtitle gives a little bit more info. It's called Seek Knowledge in China, Thinking Beyond the Abrahamic Box. Thinking beyond the Abrahamic box. So the idea here is that especially because we're Western Muslims that live in lands that have been historically influenced mostly by Christianity, we tend to understand Islam from within the Abrahamic box. And that makes sense because that's where we live, and that's the easiest connection for us, is to draw on the similarities between our tradition and the traditions of the people that we live around. But what he's trying to bring out here is that that's not always the case. And in the case of Islam in China, now you're dealing with a long-standing Muslim community for essentially a millennia, even more, about 1300 years almost now. And that community has been there for a long time and is indigenous to that land and functioning within the frameworks of that land. And it's not an Abrahamic tradition that dominates the philosophical and theological discussions of that land. So what did they do? What did the Muslims there do? And so I found it to be, I've read pieces of it before, but I really sat down and read it again recently, and I found it to be really interesting. So oftentimes when you tell people that there's such thing as Chinese Muslims, they're often surprised. Even though we're talking about an extremely large population of many millions of people. This is it's not a small community. And then if they do have any sort of understanding of Muslims in China, usually they're referring to the Uyghur Muslims in the western provinces of China, who are not ethnically Chinese. They're ethnically Turkish, from Turkic peoples of Central Asia. And in fact, when we were in Azhar, there were a lot of students from that area of China, and when you ask them where they're from, they don't say that they're from China. I forget exactly what it was, East Turkestan or East Turkmenistan? Turkestan, East Turkestan, they say, yeah. And so they say, they don't say we're from China, actually and they're actually not the point of this article. The point of the article is those who are ethnically Chinese, and that's what he spends time on. And that community has been there for a very, very long time. In many cases, they're a community that, because of the things that I just said, are oftentimes seen as almost being invisible. People don't even realize that they're there. And also in Azhar, there were also ethnically Chinese students as well. And it was very interesting. Even at USC right now, we have one or two who are from China proper in the sense of, ethnically Chinese, and it's very interesting, subhanAllah. And one of the stories that he mentions in here is of a Western visitor, non-Muslim Western visitor to China, who observed a Chinese-looking man, quote unquote, in a white skull cap outside the city's principal masjid, and said to this person, "The building has the look of a pagoda, yet it is a mosque. How strange. The Muslims in China are the Turkic populations of Xinjiang." The man replied, "Look at me. I'm not Uyghur, and I do not belong to any Turkic-speaking population. I speak Chinese. I'm from Beijing. I'm a Muslim, and I'm Hui." Right? So he's saying, we've been here too. You're not the only ones. And they are one of the largest ethnic and religious minorities in China. And they live in every area, rural, urban, coastal, central. uh, very widely spread out, but oftentimes closely concentrated around masajid. And so there's a popular saying of the Hui people that says, "We are widely scattered in small concentrations." They're all over the place, but they're around the masajid, right? So all over the place, but around the masajid. And they've played Muslims in China have played an important role in the history of the country. Probably the most famous of those is a person called Zheng. I'm gonna butcher all of the names, so we'll just agree on that from the beginning. It's unfortunate, but it's my limitation. So this individual, in English they write his name as Zheng, his first name, and the last name is He. And he was an admiral of the China Imperial Star Fleet from 1405 to 1433. So, we learn in school here, 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And 1492 is also the fall of Muslim Spain. It marks the year that I think it was Cordoba was finally overtaken, or Granada was finally overtaken, and that was the last of what was standing in Muslim Spain, and that's why they were able to afford to make these journeys to the western lands, so to speak. And but he's the admiral of this fleet from 1405 to 1433. So that precedes Columbus by 60 to 70 years, roughly. And there's a book that he quotes in here is interesting because I randomly fell across this book in Barnes & Noble years ago. And I started reading it, and I thought it was so fascinating. And he makes the argument in there, and he talks about it. And he also has a really amazing description in here of when the Chinese fleet came into Cairo, and what Cairo was like in that time, and how the fleet was accepted and stuff. Is amazing. The book's called 1421, the year China discovered America. And the author basically argues that China discovered America in 1421, and the admiral of that fleet, the chief captain and admiral of that fleet, is a Muslim. Zheng He is like the most famous admiral in Chinese history. So they played very central roles in many different areas, and of course we have this statement that's attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he was. It's attributed to him that he said, "Seek knowledge in China," as Shaykh Ahmed Kurdi mentioned to me, Hafidahullah, one of the teachers here at IOK and one of the sheikhs at IOK. He shared with me an article on it, and it's claimed that this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but at best it's weak and at worst it's fabricated. But nonetheless, it's a very central part of Muslim life, like cultural lore. For some reason, everyone talks about seek knowledge even in China, and that's kind of like everyone will quote it, even though it's most likely not a hadith. But anyways, it's part of Muslim thought, and these Muslims, they've lived there for a really, really long time, and they actually haven't been studied very much. Really, you start seeing studies on the Muslims in China around the 19th century. And interestingly enough, although it probably shouldn't be surprising to us, for people who have some knowledge of colonialism, oftentimes there were missionary projects that preceded colonialism. But nonetheless, in the 19th century, people started to get interested in the Muslim population in China, and the ones who were really interested in it were Christian missionaries. Because although Christianity came into China from very early on, it didn't last. And now they see that Islam came into China from very early on in Islam, but it lasted. So they want to see what is the difference, right? But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of work on that. The history of Islam in China, it stretches over 5 major imperial dynasties. So all the way from the 7th century in the modern calendar, or the Gregorian calendar, 7th century, so shortly after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even some claim that some of the companions reached there, but most likely, like even from the time of Uthman radiallahu an, there were efforts to in that direction, and for sure from the time of the Umayyads and the Abbasids. So in 755, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur sent Muslim soldiers to China to suppress a rebellion, to help the ruler suppress a rebellion. So from 755, now some of these facts, it's not the point whether or not that was the right decision. We're just describing what happened and that the Muslims were there, right? So 755, he sends soldiers in to help quell a rebellion. So at least from then, for sure, Muslims are there. From 755, so we're talking 1300 years. Oftentimes that was in a military capacity. Oftentimes it was also in the capacity of traders who received legitimacy and support from the state. They were allowed to be there. And oftentimes actually these Muslim merchants who were in China, they weren't allowed to live wherever they wanted. They were to live in certain quarters. And so the Muslims had their own communities, and oftentimes they even had their own governance, that the Chinese authorities would appoint special governing committees of elders who were usually Muslims and bore honorable official titles to oversee the affairs of the Muslims in the lands. So they were kind of like semi-autonomous but living amongst themselves in these areas. And that continued in the early period. But in this period they were still considered to be foreign guests for the most part. They were there, but they were basically considered to be foreigners. And that could last for generations. Which is interesting. So he says, for example, the early records speak of Muslim China-born guests even after the 5th generation. So we might have Muslims who were born in China 5 generations in, but they're still considered to be foreign guests because they weren't technically, Chinese. In the early 13th century, the Mongols invaded China and conquered China and kind of changed everything, basically, as to how the Muslim population is going to be involved there. So those Mongol conquests, they obviously conquered China. They conquered many of the Muslim lands, the great centers of Muslim civilization, Central Asia, Iran, the Eastern Arab world. They just destroyed everything, and they massacred entire populations, right? And we know, of course, the history of Baghdad. It's always mentioned that the destruction of Baghdad at the hands of the Mongols, and that the rivers were, one river was running red with blood and the other was running black with ink from all the books that were destroyed and all of these different things. But Allah did what He wanted to do, and 1 or 2 generations later they became Muslims. Allah did what He wanted to do. But nonetheless, the Mongols, they spared specific groups of Muslims, particularly craftsmen. The Muslim civilizations were generally craft civilizations. Like you have trades of people who are specialists in doing certain things. Like this person's a leather maker, this person's a woodworker, this person works with metal, so on and so forth. So they're all talent based, and so they would spare certain groups of craftsmen because that would be useful to them, as well as the women and children. And then many of them were forcibly marched to China. So actually the Muslim demographic in China shifts because many of these Muslim lands that were conquered by Mongols, they would force the Muslims into China to serve different roles, either in the administration of the government or in these different crafts that they were in. And they welcomed them in the government, to the point that when Marco Polo visited China, it's amazing the overlaps in history that you don't know about. So when Marco Polo visited China, there was a person named Sayyid al-Ajal, Sayyid Dianji, who was from Bukhara in Central Asia, obviously from where Imam al-Bukhari is from. But he was well regarded in China, and when Marco Polo came in the 13th century, he was the imperial minister of finance. And later on, he was appointed to be the governor of a particular province, where he promoted Confucianist culture and introduced the Islamic religion. So these were people who, they held powerful positions. And what also happened was that under the Mongols, they were no longer segregated, forced to be segregated the way that they were before, and they weren't kind of like put into their own thing. So the Mongols encouraged Muslim migration to China, which led to an influx of notable scientists and scholars, and the vibrant community of Chinese Muslims that emerged helped to link China to the outside world as well, ultimately creating the intercontinental networks of trade and commerce that prefigured present-day globalism. So, when they talk about globalism and all these kind of things, then people make it sound as if the pre-modern world didn't have international relations and connections, right? Especially in the lands that the Muslims were in, there were huge, massive networks of international trade, international relations. The Muslims actually essentially invented the check. It's called a suck, a suck in Arabic. Like it's so that you don't have to carry large quantities of gold and silver from all over the world when you're trading. You have these banknotes basically, and Muslims spread into all of these different areas. And so if you're in China and you have Muslims that are in particular positions in the government and they're allowed to trade and all of these kind of things, and that automatically opens up your relationships with the rest of Southeast Asia, with South Asia, with the Middle East, with Central Asia. All of these things are opened up for you because all of those areas have Muslims in them or are Muslim ruled. So these, it's sometimes our picture of pre-modern history is a lot more primitive than it actually was, but nonetheless, this ended the segregation of that period. And by the 14th century, the Muslims are no longer foreigners. They're not really looked at as foreigners. Now, if you notice, that's a long time, right? Like 14th century, we said they got in there in the 8th century. So, in all, you're talking like good 500, 600 years for that process to take place, which we'll come back to later. But by the time the 14th century comes and the Ming Dynasty comes, which is now ethnically Chinese, so ethnically Chinese are now ruling China again by the 14th century. And at this point now, Muslims are no longer foreigners, and they played their usual roles of officers, soldiers, administrators. They also took part in higher Chinese culture, including literature and philosophy, and this is significant, which we'll come back to later, which is that Muslims now they're truly part of this place, to the extent that they're engaged in philosophy, they're engaged in literature, they're engaged in cultural production. They're part of the place that they live in. And it was under this Ming rule that they got the title of Hui. And that is important because you can't just automatically get that title. That has to be something that's given to you by the government in China, and it's a stamp of acceptance and a symbol of their status. And that became the case then. That lasted about 300 years. Right, so we're in the 14th century. It lasts 300 years. In 1644, that was brought to an end by the Manchurians, a warlike nomadic people from China's northeastern expanses, and they established the Qing dynasty, which lasted until 1912. So he's taking us just a quick history to understand. In the early part of that period, the culture of the Chinese Muslims, it flourished, and things were going well. But in the later part of that period, there was a lot of conflict, actually. And you started to see Han, which are the non-Muslim ethnic Chinese, and the Hui, you started to see violence between the two groups, and a lot of bloodshed and wars and battles and different things that actually, some of them were really significant in terms of the death that resulted. I'll give you one of them in a second. This wasn't really... it's interesting because by that point, again, they're not foreigners anymore, right? Which is a reminder to us that nothing is guaranteed to last forever. Right? They're not foreigners anymore and everything is good, but still, like, political conflicts and social unrest can come very quickly. And it can come, obviously Bosnia is a reminder also of that. But these things are very fragile in many cases. From the 1780s to the 1930s, there were many actually reports of communal violence that occurred in China between the various groups. And he says that it kind of resembles almost what was happening between Hindus and Muslims at the time of the partition. So it was really significant. It peaked between 1855 and 1878. In a particular area called Gansu, there were a number of basically like severe bloodshed. So I'll read you this paragraph. The entire region was depopulated. Its original population of 15 million was decimated to 1 million. And one person in every 10 was killed. So 15 to 1 million doesn't mean all of them were killed. Many people probably just left, right? But it went from 15 million to 1 million, and 1 in 10 were killed. So if you have 15 million, how many were killed? 1.5 million, right? It's a significant number of people killed. And 2/3 of them were Hui, and everyone else was refugees. So there's a really significant violence that was going on at that time. The Nationalist Party overthrows the Manchurians in 1912, establishes the Republic of China. It was relatively okay in that period, but still there was communal violence still happening. 1949, the Communist Party takes over. It was really bad in that period. Um, Communist Party, of course, is not pro-religion, regardless of what religion it is, and so there was a lot of destruction of mosques, temples, churches, all kinds of things. After Mao's death, the Communist Party kind of changed a little bit. 1976, it got a little bit better, but that leads us up basically to the modern times, right? And there's still some significant conflict in the modern times. People may have seen a lot of it revolves around the Uyghur community, but there's still issues, right? So now he gets into the real point of the article, which is you have this community of people in this area, and they've been living there for this significant period of time. So let's talk about the issue of interpretive control and self-definition. So if you remember, all the articles, they all build on each other in some way. It may be subtle, but you'll see how they build on each other. So initially, we talked about mercy, right? Opening the conversation. We talk about one God, many names, and the idea that using God is okay, the word God, and what is its history, and so on and so forth. And then we talked about Islam and the cultural imperative, and why it's important to understand culture and contribute to culture, and so on. And then you get up now to an example, practical example of a Muslim population outside of the Abrahamic history that did contribute to culture and did actually do self-definition. And so what can we learn from that? So that's where he's coming to now. Then in the next article, which we'll do after Ramadan, inshallah, if these gatherings continue, we'll go into Living Islam with Purpose, which is basically Dr. Omar's article on how Muslims in America need to understand and think about Islam. And it's much longer than these ones. It's like 40, 50 pages rather than 10 or 15. So it'll take a number of sessions, but that's there. And then after that, there's an article on the history of Muslims in early America. So all of it, they all build into one another. So interpretive control and Hui self-definition. Historically, China was called the Middle Kingdom. Right? Chinese referred to China as the Middle Kingdom, and this expressed the belief that the Chinese tradition is based on harmony with heaven and earth, the two great metaphysical realities, making China the sacred land and placing it at the center of the cosmos. So this is the way they looked at themselves. And Islam cannot flourish in China without tempering its Semitic character and creating a respectful relationship towards China's ancient civilization. So if Islam is going to survive here, it has to understand where it is and present itself in a way that is going to be understandable to the people. So the scholars of that land, they delved deeply into the Islamic sciences as well as the traditional sciences of the place that they're in. And that's really the key. The dual mastery of both of these traditions is the key to producing something that is going to be really, really meaningful. The challenge with that is that it has to be dual mastery. Like a fake superficial mastery of Islam and Islamic sciences will not be good enough, and a fake superficial mastery of the place's actual knowledge will not be good enough. And that's why it's really challenging. You don't find many people who can truly do that. But that's what they did. And this wasn't just a Western scholarship, he says, they talk about the Chinese Islam as a making Chinese of Orthodox Islam, and that's not actually really fair in the sense that it makes it seem like what they came up with there was not actually Islam, which is not true. It is Islam, but they just express things in different ways. And it also makes it seem like then that it limits the flexibility of Islam if you talk about it in that way. But Islam is actually very flexible while respecting its major principles, which we'll see. Regional cultural receptivity produced a marvelous mosaic of unity and diversity still in evidence today. This is what Islam did, right? So the beautiful quote here is, in reality, neither Muslim societies in history nor classical Islamic law produced uniform patterns of cultural expression. Muslims have always formulated distinctive indigenous forms of Islamic cultural expression wherever they went, and the process was encouraged by Islam's religious law. Regional cultural receptivity produced a marvelous mosaic of unity and diversity still in evidence today. This is what Islam did. It went to different places, produced amazing culture, civilization that was still truly Muslim and truly in line with Islam. One of the major ways where places where we see this is in mosque design, which we talked about in Islam and the cultural imperative, is the importance of how we design masajid. And in the time that we covered that, actually, I visited Boston, which is one of the examples that I gave of good design of a masjid in America. The Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center or Community Center, I don't know what but it's an amazing place. I mean, first of all, it sits on Malcolm X Boulevard, which is in and of itself just a wonderful thing for the symbolism of the building. And then the building itself is clearly a masjid and has a dome, it has a minaret, but it's all designed with red brick, and it completely blends in with the neighboring buildings. There's a Boston Community College that's right next to it, and people often walk into the masjid thinking it's the community college, even though it's clearly a masjid, but it's clearly also, it's that distinct with that part of the landscape. And the way they designed it like as if hands are opening. So when you enter into the masjid, the hand opens, you walk up the stairs, and it opens to the left is the musalla and the prayer space, and to the right is a cafe. So it's a very interesting place. Mosque architecture shows that. In China, we have that. The Chinese and Muslim architecture of masajid was very Chinese. And one of the imams of the Beijing Central Mosque said of the Hui people, it's a very beautiful statement. He said, Hui Muslims are just like this mosque. On the outside, we look altogether Chinese. On the inside, we are Muslims, pure and real. Or technically, he said, we are pure and real, which we'll get to later, why that particular usage is used. Muslims in China, they specialized in Arabic literature, calligraphy, and they also specialized in Chinese calligraphy, because of course the two great traditions of calligraphy in the world are Chinese and Arabic. And so now you're at a perfect crossroads for that to be something that you do as a community. So they have beautiful Chinese calligraphy in the masajid, they also have beautiful Arabic calligraphy, and it would be very common to see the phrase, the primordial religion from the foundation of heaven. The primordial religion from the foundation of heaven is one of the ways that they would say Islam, which will come later. But the idea is that you can't, Chinese as a language and as a script is not phonetic, the way Latin scripts are, or the way that Arabic is, or it's not, you don't just write the letters and you pronounce them. It's symbols, right? So you have to choose what symbol is going to represent the sound, and then it might not actually make sense. So they face this issue, and we'll see how they dealt with it in talking about God, and talking about Islam, and talking about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You can't really write Muhammad in Chinese. You can make those letters and sounds and put them together, and then with regional variations, you might get all kinds of different things. So what do you then refer to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as, when you don't have that term in your language? It's a very interesting question, right? So these are things that you would find in their masjid. And of course, this is part of Islam. Ali radiallahu anhu said, speak to people in terms familiar to them. Would you like to cause falsehood to be attributed to God and His Messenger? Speak to people in terms familiar with them. And Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said, never will you speak words to people that their intellects fail to understand, but that it will be a trial for some among them. So you talk to people in a way that they can understand. Otherwise, they're going to reject it when they probably shouldn't even reject it. So if you're in this context now, how do you talk about Islam in a way that's not going to cause people to immediately reject it? And that's an important question for us to think about as well, with all of the negative press and everything else. How do I even bring up Islam in a way that doesn't automatically get rejected? It's a tough question. So the Hui Muslims, they started to think then, how are we're gonna deal with this? And again, the script was a big problem, but they figured it out. And some of the examples, for example, to refer to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they would call him the chief servant, which has a symbol, the chief servant, or the sage, or the utmost sage, or the human ultimate, right? It's true, right? The human ultimate is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's the ultimate human being. So these are true expressions, but they're expressions that are indigenous to the culture that they're living in. they would refer to Tawheed as returning to the One. That's the symbol you use for Tawheed, returning to the One. Or the Quran would be referred to as the classic, or the heavenly classic, or the real classic, or the true mandate. These are beautiful expressions, right? But they fit into the philosophy and history of the Chinese people and their language. They would refer to the Qibla as the direction of heaven. Right? This is the direction of heaven is the Qibla. Or they refer to the Alam al-Shahada, the physical world, Alam al-Shahada. They would refer to it as the color world. And Alam al-Ghaib, the unseen, they would refer to as the colorless world. And those are things that were understood to the people. The garden was referred to as heaven country and the ultimate happiness, and hell was referred to as earth prison and earth prohibited because of the metaphysical understanding of earth and heaven in their scriptures. So this is a really interesting thing. So let me read you one of these descriptions that one of the Hui scholars gave talking about Islam. So they're doing it in the language. This is our pure and real religion. That's what they would call Islam. The religion of the pure and real, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. But our pure and real religion, the true faith, arose in the West, meaning the Middle East for them, right? The West. And came to China over the years, beginning from the time of the Tang dynasty. Our recognition of the real Lord and Creator, which came from the first human being, had not yet been lost in China. Investigate the essence of this matter. Return to the source. By this, you too may take hold of the correct doctrine of the pure and the real. It's a beautiful, it's perfectly within what they're doing. The Shahada would be called very words of the pure and the real. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Muhammad, the very words of the pure and the real. This is the ultimate expression of what pure and real is, right? The pure, in early Chinese, dictionaries, they'd say, the pure and the real lacks desire. It is everything that cannot change. The pure stood for inward and outward purity. It connoted lucidity of belief and thought and the lack of selfish motives. The real was a name for the creative principle, God, and corresponded to Chinese notions of the eternal truths that underlie the cosmic order. Eternal truths that underlie the cosmic order is basically sunnatullahi fil khalq. Right? It's the rules that Allah has put in creation. We talk about it in our tradition. So it's very interesting how they put these two concepts together to accurately describe what Islam was. And this is, of course, an example of interpretive control, right? So now they're taking ownership of their own presence in this particular land and how it's going to be expressed and understood. That's the real point, right? So now you have Muslims who live in this land, they're from this land, they've been in that land, and they're going to figure out how it is that we talk about Islam, right? And it's not like they were outside of orthodoxy or something. I mean, we're going to get to it in a second, but some of the examples are one person, his name was Wang Dayu, and the other was Liu Zi. And they're regarded in some ways as the culmination of Chinese Muslim thought, like people who really mastered both of the traditions. They both memorized the Quran at early ages. They mastered the Hanafi school of law. All of the Chinese Muslims are Hanafi. There was not really any exceptions to that. And they were also trained in theology, philosophy, metaphysical Sufism or spirituality, and so they bring all of these things to the table, and then they want to understand the Chinese tradition as well. Wang Dayu, he was born in the late 16th century and had an exclusively Islamic education as a youth. Right, so all Islamic studies as a youth, and then he gained standing as a Muslim scholar, and then he realized that he doesn't know anything about the Chinese tradition, and he figured that was stupidity and smallness, that he doesn't know anything about the Chinese tradition. And then he put great effort into getting a good grasp of those things. And Liu Zi, his father was a Muslim scholar who looked up to the first one. And so when he was training his son, he made sure that he got both, and that he was going to be able to contribute in both realms. And what they did was they wrote in ways that were accessible to the people of the land that they were living in, so much so that they're able to reach the Muslims who go to school there, and they're completely trained in the Chinese tradition, not the Muslim one, right? And then they're also able to reach non-Muslims who are also like now thinking about these things. And he tells one story that the abbot of the Iron Mountain Buddhist monastery, so the abbot of this monastery, actually came out of the mountain to question Wang Dio and engaged him in debate for several days. They're back and forth for several days on debate. And in the end, the abbot acknowledged the superiority of Wang's thought and became his disciple. It's because he's able to speak to him in a way that he understands, right? Once Liu Zi was asked about the nature of life and death from an Islamic point of view, and he responded in a classically Chinese manner. This is what he said. It's really, life is also not life, and death is also not death. So they asked him about life and death. He said, life is also not life, and death is also not death, right? So the person said, please give me one more word. Like, tell me a little bit more. So he says, life is also not life because it has death. And death is also not death because it returns to life. So it's really, you could see how they were enveloped in this. They acknowledge the integrity and the truth of some of the things in the tradition that they came from, which is an important starting point, right? One of the things that we have to realize in American culture, for example, although it's diverse and although it's extremely changing now, and it's obviously not as long-lasting and rich as the Chinese tradition, but there were things in American culture that were really good. And as long as they're good for us, we should try to revive them. Like one of the things that we were talking about earlier was the good classical American tradition of the family eating dinner together. And that was something that people used to do. And that's a small thing, but we would agree that it's good. The more hands are in the food, the more barakah there is, right? And we eat communal meals. We don't eat individual meals. And like in a truly kind of like Muslim culture type thing, we eat communal meals. You don't eat by yourself. Ibrahim alayhi salam wouldn't eat by himself. He would share his food. And so to have a community, to have meals as a family is a good thing, right? So it's an example of the kind of, they accept that there's good things in the cultural tradition that they came from and the intellectual tradition that they came from, and they're willing to build on it. And they're willing also to critique it if it's not right and if it's not correct, and that if Islam has something better to offer, they're perfectly fine with that. They'll go into that critique, right? In a way that is respectful, in a way that is not abrasive, and so on and so forth. One of the things that one of these scholars said is that the metaphysics of Islam is a big part of it is to have clear virtue, to know what is right and wrong. Right? One of the big things about Islam is that it will clarify to you what is right and wrong, what is true and what is untrue, what is real and what is not real. So he gives this quote. He said, when clear virtue is clarified, there will be real knowledge. When there is real knowledge, the self will be known. When the self is known, the heart will be made true. When the heart is made true, intentions will be sincere. When intentions are sincere, words will be firm. When words are firm, the body will be cultivated. When the body is cultivated, the family will be regulated. When the family is regulated, the country will be governed. That's very Islamic concepts, right? But very beautifully expressed within that tradition. They actually, more than Taoism and Buddhism, the Muslims tended to work more within the tradition of Confucianism, because they felt that there's great overlap between the Confucianism and the teachings of Islam, more so than the other ones even. And so much so that there's a work that Liu Zi wrote called The Philosophy of Arabia. And it won the approval of the Confucianist vice minister of the Chinese Board of Propriety, right? So who wrote in the preface of the work, although his book explains Islam, in truth it illuminates our Confucianism. So he's saying is like, he was able to express the truth and the strength of Islam in a way that was so compatible with what people already understood, that they felt that Islam actually clarifies what they believe, right? It's an amazing concept. And then they wrote and they said that there's 5 shared principles between Islamic and Chinese views of reality. So now they're looking like, how does Chinese philosophy look at reality? How does Islam look at reality? Right? So there's 5 shared views. The first of these is the oneness of God. Confirmed that all existence is governed by a single supreme reality. They might express it differently, but there's a single supreme reality. So the number 1 is God. Number 2 is affirmed the continuity of nature and the equilibrium and perfect harmony of heaven, earth, and the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things is a reference to all created things, basically. So that there's, second principle is that both agree that there's continuity and equilibrium in creation. Right? We agree on that, and they would agree on that. The third principle was that of the middle way, prophetic law and the sunnah. So, which eliminated extremism and laid the foundation of a healthy individual and social life. So the Chinese philosophy would seek a middle way. Not too far this way, not too far that way, and we would also say that this is the sunnah. Sunnah is to be wasata. Then number 4 is the primary humanistic component of the middle way, which is the realization of the perfect human as the embodiment of the way. So the idea here is that if you accept that there's a single creator, and you accept that there's continuity and equilibrium in all of creation, and you accept that the path that should be traveled is the middle way, and one does all of those things, then the result is the person that embodies the consequence of that. And the greatest example of that would be the prophets, right? And then to a lesser degree, the wise people that came after them. But they would be, the idea is that there are wise people and sages that exist who understand this equilibrium and understand the reality of existence. And the final principle was the universal humanistic component of human perfection in general. And that means that basically that one should seek that. That one should seek that. And so then he expresses it. Liu Zi says the following: only those who are pure and real can fully realize their nature. Again, pure and real is Islam. So only people who have accepted the pure and real can fully realize their nature. Fully able to realize their nature, they can fully realize the nature of humanity. Fully able to realize the nature of humanity, they can realize the nature of things. Puts everything in its place. Fully able to realize the nature of things, they can partake in the transformative and nourishing process of heaven and earth. They can take care of the things. They understand themselves, they understand their place, they understand the nature of things, now they can take care of the things. Being able to partake in the transformative and nourishing process of heaven and earth, they can form the third essential element in unison with heaven and earth. It means they can maintain the equilibrium of existence. Or they could be like modern humans and completely throw it out of balance and destroy everything. Right? This is the way we live now. It's very scary. People, of course, had pollution before, and they had trash, and they had things like that. But generally, historically, if you produce trash, you have to deal with it yourself. It doesn't just up and disappear. Who knows where it goes, right? And so you see the consequences of what you do with your own hands. So the conclusion then is that, this emphasis on the art of learning to be human as an essential part of religion is one of the greatest legacies of the Hui Muslim culture for the world today. There's a deep emphasis on learning what it means to truly be human. So big emphasis in the teachings. And although we live in the information age, our knowledge of ourselves and others tends to be ill-informed and superficial. And we too must cultivate knowledge of the human tradition within and without the Abrahamic box, meaning inside and outside, in the same earnestness and profundity. You have an example here of people who figured that out. And yes, there were some conflicts here and there, and there was some bloodshed, but at the same time, those were political and social issues. They weren't cultural and religious issues in the end, primarily. This paragraph is really good, and it's hard to be short on, and I probably would make a mistake if I did, so I'm just going to read it to you. He says, in assessing the realities of the Muslim diaspora and East-West relations, there are reasons for hope as well as despair. The two possibilities should motivate disciplined work in the tradition of Wang Deyu and Li Zi without giving in to excessive enthusiasm or loss of hope. The universal law of opposites, which lies at the foundation of the Chinese and Islamic worldviews, requires sobriety and wisdom in confronting challenges. Right. In Arabic, they say al-ashya tu'raf bi-addadiha, that things are known by their opposites. There's an understanding that, this is how we get to know things. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's rough, sometimes it's easy, but we get to a deeper understanding of reality through that. The Book of Changes, an ancient Chinese classic, the I Ching, focuses on the law of opposites, which it expresses in the well-known symbol of the primal binaries of yin and yang. The figure indicates that opposites, including hope and hopelessness, are forever interlinked and mixed by their very nature. They can never occur in complete isolation, and each binary necessarily gives birth to its opposite. What gives us hope brings the potential of hopelessness. What leads to our despair is also a reason for hope. They're linked like that. One poet, he says about the relationship, the romantic relationship between a man and a woman. He says, I want to be the one that makes you the happiest and hurts you the most. It's the reality, right? Like if someone's very close to you, it doesn't mean that I want to hurt the person the most. But the reality of being the person that makes the person the happiest, it means you can also be the person who makes the person the most hurt. It's just the reality of the position. The opposites are linked together. You can't get rid of them. So finding this common ground between Islamic civilization and Western civilization is obviously something that we really need to think about. There's not actually a conflict there. And the conflicts the so-called conflicts that have existed are issues that were described as in the following way by Richard Eden. He observes, geographically and in terms of beliefs and values, Islam was never alien to the West, but actually too close for comfort. It's not that it was so distant or foreign or different. It was that it's too close for comfort. It was proximity, similarity, and conflicting geopolitical interest, not irreconcilable differences, that turned the two sister civilizations into rivals. It's not that they're so different, it's that actually they're so similar that they became rivals. And there's a really interesting book that talks about this that I would encourage people to read by Richard Bullitt, who's a history professor at Columbia, called The Case for the Islamo-Christian Civilization. And basically what he argues in there is that in some ways it's more accurate to refer to an Islamo-Christian civilization than it is to refer to a Judeo-Christian civilization. That it's actually Islam and Christianity that were working so much side by side and contributing to one another and taking from one another and influencing one another so much over so many centuries that it's more accurate to claim Islamo-Christian civilization than it is to claim something else. So it's a really interesting read. And inshallah, these are the kind of things that we can bring to the forefront as we continue to explore those similarities and what it means for Muslims who are living in the West. I mean, in the end of the day, our mandate is to carry the message of God and His Messenger, and to recognize that the message of God and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is not unique to any particular place, nor unique to any particular culture, and that insofar as it's possible, we want to deliver that, and we want to deliver that in a way that is authentic, in a way that is relevant at the same time, and inshallah we will. That is the hope. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq. Sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam taslima kathira walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Any questions, comments, observations that anyone wants to share? Mm-hmm. Subhanallah. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Subhanallah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah, I saw those too. I remember there's a brother that we met when we were studying there. He was a Uyghur Muslim, and he said that in order for him to go study in Azhar, his family actually sold their home. Right? They sold their home so they can have the money for him to go study. And he said, when I go back to my country, I can't teach in open. I have to teach underground. But this is the dedication still, you know. Sold their home so he can go study and then he'll come back, teach underground. Mm. Oh, really? Subhanallah. Wow. Wow. Subhanallah. Yeah. Mm. Subhanallah. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, Mao's cultural revolution was really bad from 66 to 76. It just so much was destroyed. Yeah, yeah, right. Destroyed a lot. Yeah, destroyed a lot of history, a lot of tradition. You know, that was the cultural revolution, was to basically destroy tradition. And that has major consequences. Subhanallah. Even one of the things that was in here was that the idea of the creator and so on, it's even in later Chinese philosophy you don't see it as much. But in very early Chinese philosophy and literature you would see it. So I could totally imagine that people now have no. Mm. 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 Subhanallah. Mhm. Yeah. Mm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing, subhanallah. A lot of history, a lot to learn from. It's adhan time. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد. جزاكم الله خير.